It is almost impossible to talk about the history of the novel without starting with a definition of it, which is by no means easy to do. We all know what we ourselves mean by a novel and have our favourite novelists, whether they are from the heyday of Victorian fiction, Dickens, say, or George Eliot, or someone more modern or postmodern, for example, B.S. Johnson, who is famed for writing a novel that was bought in a box with loose pages that you could read in any order. Again, you might be a fan of crime or detective fiction, which brings the added complication of genre. That is, does the fact that a work of fiction is comedy, tragedy, satire, ghost story, and so on, affect our definition? Anyway, as far as the history of the English novel is concerned, we're on fairly solid ground when we date the first novels to the late 17th and early 18th centuries. The first that is still read as a novel, in the way we read novels now, is Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, which did have an enormous effect on English prose writing. But, for me, it would be Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. Now, people have tried to locate the beginnings even earlier than this, to Elizabethan prose writing, and even further back. But I think this is to lose sight of what a novel is and does, and confuses any kind of fiction with the true novel.
It was the philosopher Thomas Nagel, I think, who came up with the thought experiment of trying to imagine what it's like to be a bat. Though I suppose any animal would do. The point is, of course, that you can't, just as you can't know what it's really like to be another person. I mean, know rather than imagine. How much can we know of what goes on in another person's mind? We observe people, watch what they do, listen to what they say, and other sounds they may make, see how they respond to their environment, their likes and dislikes, what they eat, and so on. And from this we have learned to make fairly accurate predictions about how they'll behave in certain situations. Yet we still can't be sure what thoughts have passed through their minds, and certainly not what it feels like to them. We can guess, based on personal experience in similar situations, so we must assume that humans are alike enough for us to be reasonably certain that, for example, we experience the colour red in roughly the same way, or in the same ways. But again, to you, red might bring to mind thoughts of blood and death, whereas to someone else, warmth or excitement. And the differences can't just be cultural.
Global financial markets are in flux about the latest World Bank forecast for the global economy, suggesting that there may be a double-dip recession and indeed another global financial crisis. I think there's good reasons to be cautiously optimistic in terms of Australia and indeed in terms of Asia. Firstly, most of the focus has been on European debt, particularly in the new European economies. Most of that doesn't affect Australia directly in terms of trade and investment. Secondly, in the area that is important to Australia in Asia, the World Bank has downgraded India quite strongly, despite the fact that trade-wise China is more directly affected by the European downturn than India is. And lastly, the emergence of China and India, ASEAN and the emerging economies is actually very, very important for Australia, and basically because Australia has very strong trade links with Asia, with the emerging economies, I think we will fare better than Europe and North America. Some years ago, the Australian historian Geoffrey Blainey wrote a very famous book called The Tyranny of Distance. It talked about how far Australia was from Europe and why that would be very bad for us economically. Well, I think now with the rise of Asia, I think we now can talk about the power of proximity replacing the tyranny of distance as Australia finds itself at the right place at the right time in the Asian century.
Excellent. He said, innovation equals invention, and let me just stop here. Innovation equals invention. Often people mistake these two things for the same thing. Innovation equals invention. They are not. Innovation is something that generates value for the world. It makes something faster, better, cheaper. It gives someone some great satisfaction. An invention is an idea, a technology, a patent. In and of itself, it does not generate value. So these two are not the same thing. And sometimes you see them interchange, and that's not correct. So innovation equals invention times commercialization. So, and when we look at this equation of innovation, something of value, it requires a new idea, and then it requires someone or some organization that is going to commercialize that idea and to make it of value to the world.
This is a bomb calorimeter. This is the actual piece of equipment that researchers use to calculate the energy content of either biodiesel or maybe even the potato chips that you had for lunch today. When they calculate the amount of energy, they're going to calculate it in heat units, which would either be joules or calories. I want you to look inside the bomb calorimeter. Inside here, you can see that there's a silver bucket. Water goes all in here. And this is actually the bomb. It's a smaller silver cylinder. What you do is put your fuel sample in there. Then, these two electrodes are connected to the bomb. These provide the spark that will ignite your sample. When your sample burns or combusts, that gives off energy. So how is the energy collected, or how does a scientist figure out how much energy is being given off? Well, it's a closed system. There's a lid here that goes on top of this calorimeter. And what's in here in the lid is a stirrer. The stirrer is going to stir the water that's in this big pool here, so that the heat given off from the sample is going to warm the water in a uniform way. This is the temperature probe. This goes down in the water also and measures the change in temperature, because as the sample is burned, it'll give off heat and the temperature of the water will increase. So the lid goes on, the sample is prepared. The last thing that you need to make a combustion reaction happen is oxygen. And at some point during the process, some oxygen is added by a tank that's connected to the calorimeter here. So we are going to burn a sample of the biodiesel that you've prepared and get some feedback on the energy content of it. You'll be able to use this to compare it to petroleum-based fuels like octane.
This is Hans Krebs, who in 1937 published a paper showing the sequence of chemical reactions by which energy is released in individual cells. It's called the Krebs cycle, which some of you may remember from your chemistry course in high school. Krebs is a wonderful example to me of how a scientist who is determined can overcome all kinds of human obstacles. Krebs' father constantly discouraged him and told him that he had just mediocre intelligence and would never do anything important in his life as a teenager. What Krebs remembers in his memoir, his father said to him, "You can't make a silk purse out of a sow's ear." And later on, when Krebs studied with the great biochemist Otto Warburg, Warburg also told him the same thing, not the same quotes, but that he had only mediocre ability and would never be a great scientist. And we all hear about how important it is for parents to encourage their children, but sometimes the children will go on to do great things no matter what we say to them.
life on Earth is the cell. All creatures on Earth are made up of cells. I'm not going to dwell on the biology of cells much. It's not that relevant, but I do want to point out a few things. First of all, there are two sorts of cells. There's a thing called the prokaryotic cell, which is fairly simple, and it's the thing that all bacteria are made of. And then we have a eukaryotic cell, a much more complicated beast on the right, which didn't appear until well into the history of the biosphere on Earth. And there are many single-celled eukaryotes, but there are also, and importantly, multicellular organisms, and all of those are based on the eukaryotic cell.
Unemployment, lost productivity, and lost contributions to the community are typical and usually uncounted costs of homelessness, and they can be addressed with an integrated strategy. Integrated housing also addresses environmental and sustainability challenges. We incorporate green design principles to create healthier buildings for our residents and staff, limit emissions, and contain energy costs to preserve affordability and reduce the impact of our buildings on the environment. Integrated housing allows a whole community response and the opportunity for mutually beneficial public-private collaborations. Corporate investors match the contributions of government to pay for the acquisition and redevelopment of the Prince George. Corporate investors receive valuable tax credit and other benefits from the federal government and significant marketing benefits for their brand locally. Philanthropy supported the initial program and business planning for the project. Student architects from a local university designed and built an entry-floor art gallery for use by community arts organizations. Historic preservation groups assisted with the fundraising for the ballroom restoration. And the restored ballroom is a rental venue used by many organizations for events, training, fundraisers, and the rental proceeds benefit Common Ground's other supportive housing work, and the jobs created through the caterers are set aside, many of them for our tenants.
But there's a plant, another dandelion relative, called Achillea, also known as yarrow. And in the Iliad, which is based on events that happened perhaps as much as 2000 BC, Achilles is mentioned as using this herb to heal the wounds of his warriors. So the use of medicinal plants certainly goes back that far. The Romans, of course, used medical herbs, including dandelions. By the time we got to the Middle Ages, dandelions were a well-established medical plant. They were something that was planted in virtually every monastery across Europe, all the many monasteries, the Benedictine monasteries. were havens of knowledge, of the classical knowledge of the ancient Greeks and Romans was kept alive in the monasteries. And monasteries, of course, they were where you would go if you were sick, because the monks were the people who knew the ways to use plants to cure people. So dandelions were a very common plant in monastery gardens. Dens leonis is medieval Latin for tooth of the lion. And of course, you can still buy dandelions off the shelf as a medicine to this day.